Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our Cherwell Advanced Practitioner webinar. Our topic for today is REST APIs. The session is being recorded. We'll also email out the link in the next couple of days when that's available, so you can feel free to share that with your team or rewatch at your leisure. If you have questions as we're going, feel free to put those questions into the chat and I'll help interrupt our presenter today and address questions as we go. If we have time at the end of the session, we'll also open it up for Q&A at the end. For anyone unfamiliar with StrataCom, we were founded in 1997 and we've always really focused on IT service management. Throughout the years, we partner with a variety of the leading ITSM software vendors, currently focused primarily on Ivanti and the Cherwell solution set. We were one of the first partners to join the program when it launched about a decade ago, and we're one of the larger partners for professional services with consultants across the country. Primarily, we're a services company, but we have expanded with add-on solutions for Cherwell. We've got offerings around mobile, Kanban boards, and pretty soon a smart bot. So hopefully that helps frame up the conversation today. Our presenter is Eric Krueger. He's one of our founding owners, and he's also a senior consultant on staff, one of our integration experts. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric to jump in and get us started on REST API.
Okay, thanks, Laura. We will kind of run through this quickly. Unfortunately, I've got a hard stop in an hour, 55 minutes now. But we will make this this presentation available for you, so you can take a look at it and download it. It's got a lot of good information in it. So I'll be doing some demos too, so you can see kind of how this stuff works. And we're going to be focusing on interacting with the Cherwell API. So we'll be mainly focusing on interacting into Cherwell from an external tool and kind of what that looks like and kind of navigating the Cherwell API from another tool. So let me share my screen. Right. Forget. No, I don't want that screen. All right, so this will be a lot of PowerPoint slides, but I'd like to do PowerPoint slides because you can download them and see all the information, because I've got a lot of good information here. Lots of tips. I'm not going to go through like hardcore, like, hey, let's build an application and create tickets in Cherwell. I'm more going to go over, that would probably be like a 4-hour lesson that we could maybe do at some point. And also, if you do want advanced practitioner call of going from Cherwell out to other API, just leave a note in the comments, and if enough people want that, I can also do that. So we could do advanced practitioner of working in Cherwell and going out to API sources. So for example, creating a Jira ticket or something like that, pretty simple, we could cover. So, but for now, I'm just going to cover coming into the Cherwell API from external sources, and I'm going to show you. Laura went over StrataCom, so I'll show you basically. I'll show you kind of the back end of our framework and how we work with the API also. So you'll get a lot of tips from what we've done. So, we built this native mobile application. We've got these Kanban boards, Gantt charts, editable drag and drop calendar. We just added ADA compliance to our front end. So we've been able to basically write new front ends to Cherwell using Cherwell's API. So I'm going to go through partly some of the challenges we had doing that, some of the challenges that if you want to do something simple like create a web page to submit some sort of a ticket or do like an approval page for people, some of the challenges you might run into. And then we'll get a little bit deeper into the API and how it works. So like token management, some of the most important API calls and things like that. So we'll go over all of that. And along the way, I don't know if I'll really show you these apps, but I'll show you the backend framework, because we really mimic how the API works with our framework developer. And you'll really be able to see the API calls and what they look like and what they return. I'm not going to show you the JSON they return, but I'll actually show you kind of a formatted screen of what you'll see. So some of the goals when we built our framework, And keep in mind, so if you're interested in interacting with the Cherwell API, you probably, maybe you're going to build something in PowerShell to put data into Cherwell. Like I've written PowerShell scripts to integrate with Active Directory, Jamf, Extra Hop. So lots of these external tools. Pretty simple to use PowerShell to write an API bridge between them. You might be writing like an ASP.NET web page, to submit tickets for your customers. So you'll kind of have to come up with your own goals, like what is the goal for how you want to interact with Cherwell. But one of our goals was the products must be completely configurable. So we wanted to write a framework that we could build products on. So Cherwell's API actually makes that pretty easy, because I would say they have like a frameworky API. So they don't have set API calls like other products might have, like a create incident API call. There is no create incident API call in Cherwell. There is only say business object, right? So it becomes really easy to create reusable API calls for all the business objects in Cherwell. So it must be easy for users to use. So in our case, we wanted customers to be able to design their own like mobile sites or Kanban boards using our framework, and real-time updates. So we added some backend stuff that Cherwell doesn't have into our solution. That's really difficult to do in Cherwell. So like real-time updates and things we were able to add in our solution. So when you do decide if you're writing a solution for Cherwell, you can really go outside of Cherwell's box of widgets that they give you and really kind of design your own. So like we were able to use WebSockets, a Microsoft implementation of its SignalR, to actually update tickets in real time. So if somebody changes like a card on our Kanban board, everybody that sees that card in any Kanban board will see that update immediately. And it's just something Cherwell doesn't have, but we're able to add and then integrate that into Cherwell. So some of the challenges we have, so there's like some missing functionality Cherwell still hasn't added. There's no way to view Cherwell team members. So if you say, hey, I want to see all the team members of first level support, Cherwell does not have an API call for that. So you can make some changes to Cherwell to do that. I think I've got a slide on that. You can't run one steps until 9.7 with REST. You had to run them with SOAP. So if you're on pre 9.7, keep that in mind. You'll need to do SOAP calls instead of REST. Most people are past that now, so it's really not as big of an issue as it was a couple years ago. And there's a lot of tables in Cherwell that are not available for REST calls. So all the trebuchet tables are not available. You can make them available, but they don't have some of the typical REST calls that I would expect in kind of an enterprise application. So for example, you may want to programmatically make a field read only on the Cherwell metadata layer, and there is no metadata API, so you can't programmatically turn on and off read-only conditions. So that would be really nice to have, be able to programmatically turn them on and off in your application, so you don't have to rely on Cherwell, like a Cherwell developer, to do that. But it's just not in Cherwell's API, so you can't do things like that. So stored queries only return the columns in the default grid, so that's kind of a weird issue. There's quite a few bugs with the API depending on the version that you have. Certain queries that pull back users' tickets have issues. I do actually have a solution for that, finally, after about a year and a half. Cherwell and me figured out what's going on there. And I would say it's not super developer friendly. I'd say super, like, for a lot of developers like me who are maybe used to more object orientation, it maybe is, but for people who are used to just being able to do a webhook, it's probably not. So here's what we'll talk about: API building blocks, token management, service accounts, authentication challenges, portal logins, running one step, saving versus creating, specifics required, Conundrum, Cherwell save queries, ad hoc queries, related records, public ID versus rec ID, getting team membership, and performance. We're going to cover all this in 46 minutes. Go. 47 minutes. All right, so API building blocks. So these are some of the building blocks of the API that you'll want. And actually, I'm going to pull up. It'll take a little extra time, but I'm actually going to pull up an API so you can actually see what it looks like. I'm going to pull up their Cherwell Swagger interface. So you'll be able to see it here. So this is their Swagger interface that you can go to. You just go to your your address and type Cherwell API after it, and it'll give you this Swagger interface. And if you're curious, I can show you how to interact with this. But so some of the core building blocks, we've got this get business object summary. That will give you the important stuff you need to know about the business object. So most of these are going to be under the business object here. So get business object summary is going to be down here. And you can see there's like, you can do it by name or business object ID or by type. So, you know, if I put in get business object ID summary, we can do that. Let me get my API key here quick, and we will put that in. I'll put in my API key, and then I can actually show you what some of these return. So to use Swagger, you put your API key up here, and then you can actually come in, get business object summary. You can actually go here. We'll do a login here. So I'll just put in my login. And now I've got a token. You can see I've got a token. So now all I have to do to test this is do, oops. So put incident, and then we'll get our summary. So here we go. So here's our summary for incident. It gives us our states that we have. This is the most important piece that you'll get back. You'll get this business object ID back, and then you can use that for step 2. So then the next building block is get business object template. This will give you all the fields in the business object, including their rec ID. So now if I take this business object ID right here, and I go to get business object template, sorry, I'm not super familiar with where this stuff is in here because I rarely use it. All right, here we go. So this is a post. So we will put in, so we can put in the field IDs that we want here. I don't even need that. We'll put the business object ID right here. And this will hopefully give us back. Yeah, so here we go. So this is a list of all the fields. So we can see rec ID is returned, incident ID is returned, created date time, and that'll give you the field ID that you need to update these in a save business object. So that's the next building block is the save business object. So save business object is another call. So save business object is right here. And so in save business object, you'll do something like this. You'll put in the business object ID, and then you put in your fields. So this field is just a list of the fields that we saw before. So every single field, you'll have this information. You'll have this dirty flag, which needs to be set to true in order for it to work. Display name's not required. Field ID is. Field ID and name, I think, are kind of interchangeable. You can do either or. I usually do both. HTML you don't need, and then value is the value you pass in. So you can see it's not super easy to put this together. You kind of need to use their building blocks in order to build these calls. But it's not super difficult once you've done that. So to show you what this looks like in our framework, what we did is we built an object configuration section where we configure objects in our framework against the API. So the first thing we do is we do the add business object. So this is doing the get business object summary call basically, and the business objects are returned. So if I want to add a new business object to our framework, like let's say I want to add a PPM portfolio object to our framework, we can. So then what I've done now is if I save this, so now I've got this PPM portfolio object added to our framework, and that stores, basically it's storing the object ID of that. There isn't a lot of other information that you need to store. And then from that, you can do lots of other API calls, like we can get all the searches for that. So you can see we've got this open portfolio and selected portfolio, so we've got a couple searches. We can pull in all the fields out of that template. So these are all the fields in the portfolio object. So this is that get business object template call that gives us all the field names. We can pull in the relationship for that object. So these are all the related, the multiple relationships that are defined in Cherwell. So that's just another API call. And then we can do things like pull in the one step. So if I add a new one step here, I can actually pull in the one steps for that. So which is another call. So we're kind of using all of these API calls to build into our framework how this stuff works. So, you know, if it was a more standard API with a save incident, we wouldn't have this type of flexibility. We'd have to create the call for every object. So this really allows us a lot more flexibility to build like an application on top of Cherwell's API, which is really why Cherwell should decouple their front end from their workflow engine and build the front end completely API based. It's kind of a newer methodology. A lot of Twitter's doing it. A lot of companies are doing that. So that would be my suggestion. But okay, so those are your API building blocks. And then let's talk a little bit about token management. So one of the things you need to do in Cherwell is get that token. So if we go back to my Swagger, you can see when I logged in here, I actually got a token. And you can actually test getting a token by going to service and posting for a token. So what happens is you get a token and it has an expires a date and time basically, and whether or not it's a refresh token or a regular token. So when you get this token, you use that for authentication once you get it. So you pass in your username and password, you get this token, and now every call after that, you don't need to re-authenticate, you just use this token. Generally, these tokens are good for 20 minutes out of the box. And then with that token, you get a refresh token. So once the token is up, you can get a new token by using your refresh token. So the idea behind this is the refresh tokens are generally good for 1 day. So the idea behind it is you only have to send your credentials over once a day, and the rest of the time you can just use this refresh token to get a token. So it's supposedly more secure because you're not passing credentials over, you're using a token, which will eventually expire, where your credentials might be good for a year or until your password changes. A token's only good for at most a day. So if somebody does get a hold of that refresh token, it's only going to be good for maybe the rest of that day, and then it won't work anymore. So it's a little more secure. It's kind of a good policy. You see a lot of companies do this with tokens and refresh tokens. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So if the same user account requests a new token with the same API key, it will invalidate the old token. So if you've got two people logging in as the same user via the API, they'll just keep overwriting the other's token. So if I request a token with my username and password, and then somebody else requests the same another token using my credentials, if you're using a service account, my token's not good anymore. It'll invalidate that token. So just something to keep in mind. Happens a lot with customers when they try to write a portal app that uses an account, or if they're using the same account across multiple integrations and they're not doing token management, they'll find out that their tokens are constantly being overwritten and they're having to re-authenticate. And then of course the refresh token doesn't work either. It invalidates the refresh token. So you have to re-authenticate with your username and password. So there is a limit to the number of tokens you can request per minute. So that's only going to happen if you're authenticating with your username and password. And I think it's 6 or something like that. I can't remember what the number is, but you'll get an error if you request too many. So that's where you want to use your tokens and your refresh tokens instead of username and passwords. You can hit that limit.
Eric, we got a
Yeah.
question in the chat.
Okay.
Why don't you just read it? Excuse me.
Oh.
If you can see it.
All right. Let me see if I can pop in the chat here. Can use OAuth or SAML credentials to generate a token. Yes. Yep. You can use SAML. Don't think OAuth, but you can use SAML to authenticate a token. So only happens if the ID and key are the same. Yes, if you use the same ID but a different API key, you will not overwrite the token. So the token is tied to the login and the API key. So if you have the same login for say 3 integrations and they're using a different key, those tokens will be good. So You only overwrite the token if you use the same API key and the same login. Okay.
All right, thanks.
So authentication challenges. So we did have a question of SAML. So SAML authentication can present some challenges. So for example, if you're not on 10, you're going to, SAML for REST is not set up out of the box. So like if you're hosted with Cherwell and you're on 10 and want to authenticate with SAML, you will need to go to Cherwell and have them update the web config. If you're on premise, you need to update your web config. And it's really simple. You only need to update it and put the server name in the web config for the API, but it's just not done. They fixed that. Well, in 10 they changed. There is no SOAP login anymore. Also, uses a different reply URL. So if you're using like Azure Active Directory or Okta or any of these SAML providers, they typically have a valid reply URLs. The REST reply URL is different than the SOAP one. So if you're on pre-version 10, you'll need to add the different reply URL to your SAML provider. It's Cherwell API instead of Cherwell service /SAML/assertion. So that's different. So Safari on iPhones, iPads, and Macs will have numerous challenges with Cherwell's REST API and SAML auth. You'll need to play with the parameters if you have these issues. Oh, where is it? Do I not have the parameters on here? Bummer. So there's a couple parameters in the web config, and there's some knowledge document articles on it. Just search like SAML Safari, and you'll find it. Even if you're on 10, you'll probably, if you try to authenticate with a Mac, you'll probably run into this issue. It's a Cherwell problem, so it needs to be fixed on the Cherwell side. So it's in the knowledge base. Just look up SAML Safari. There's two parameters. They're both true false, and there's some combination of that trues and falses that will work. So, but it's kind of a pain in the butt. It's the biggest problem we have, honestly, with our framework is getting Cherwell to play nice with Mac and iOS devices for SAML authentication. So if you're developing a portal app, there's no authentication message for portal logins. So for the REST API, so you can only authenticate using the SOAP API. With the SOAP API login, then you can authenticate who they are. It's not a true authentication because they don't use the Cherwell license. So Cherwell is basically telling you, yes, this person exists in our database, and that's about all you get back. But from there, like what we do for our portal, we use a service account then, and we tell the service account who the person is. So like in our portal, we have a little variable called logged in user. So on the portal side, that's the person who logged in. So, but anything that's done is going to be done by the service account because the portal users don't have access to the REST API. So if you update the ticket, it's going to look like it was updated by the portal account or by the service account for the portal. So you got to have a solid token management strategy here because this is where you can really get messed up on tokens. Especially if you have like hundreds or thousands of people logging in, because the actual login for the work, like if you're running a query to show the user their open tickets, that's going to be done by the service account. So you just need to make sure that service account is doing token management properly, so you're not constantly getting new tokens and overwriting with the logins. Version 10 does work differently than earlier versions. Version 10, you'll need, I believe in pre-version 10, the return URL for portal login is encrypted. And actually, if you wanted to work in pre-version 10, you need to decompile the trebuchet DLL and get the encryption key out of it in order for it to work. In version 10, they stopped encrypting it's like the final URL where it goes. They stopped encrypting it, so you don't have to worry about it. But in pre-version 10, if you do want to do that login and send them somewhere, you will have to get that encryption key out of the trebuchet DLL. Not very difficult to get, but so running one steps kind of another gotcha in pre 9.7. So in 9.7, one steps can be run with the REST API. Pre 9.7, they have to be run with SOAP. So for our pre 9.7 customers, if they're on LDAP, it's really not a problem because they're entering the credentials into our application and we're passing them over. If they're on SAML, we actually are double authenticating them. So we're authenticating them via the SAML REST and then re-authenticating them via the SAML SOAP. And there is a checkbox in Cherwell that you have to check, Cherwell mobile SOAP login, so that works. So that's on the Cherwell side. So once again, to run the one steps, they have the same encryption method. So you've got to decrypt the Trebuchet DLL to get the encryption key to actually encrypt the redirect URI properly. So probably nobody is doing that besides us. I doubt anyone else has figured that out. But in order to do that in pre 9.7, that's what you got to do. In pre and post 9.7, for one step's not a problem because you're on REST. So the other thing with one steps, they can't be in the blueprint folder. They will not be found by the API. There is a idea scale thing out there to fix that, and Cherwell has not fixed it in years, so I don't think it's going to get fixed. So any one steps you want to call have to go into the global folder, which gives people access to them, but that's what you got to do. So if, like in our framework, if I go in and I want to run a one step for like if I go to our incidents, it's just our public demo site. But if I go to incidents and I want to run a one step for, if I've got, yeah, here we go, like set pending one step, that has to be in the global folder. So some of these aren't, and they need to be put in a global folder. Sometimes we have customers make like a folder in the global folder called mobile or Kanban or something, and they copy these into the global folder. But so you can see for incident, these are all the one steps in the global folder. If you have ones in Blueprint, they just will not show up in here. So, so that is definitely a problem we've run into, and something if you want to run one steps and that doesn't show up, you'll need to make sure they're in the global folder. Let's see, certain UI items in the one step may cause the one step to fail from the API call, like pop-up messages that require input. You need to make sure, especially in version 10, that stuff's really broken. So any input things that's not a parameter, you got to turn off. Otherwise, it'll just hang. If you're using branch logics or not a parameter, but a prompt. So if you're using branch logics and prompts, you must build the prompt builder on the API side. So for example, I've got this load one step prompts. So we've got pending reason comes back as the prompt. So we can see, so here's all the prompts for this. So pending reason is a prompt in here. And take note that Cherwell uses set pending to remove pending and to set pending. It's the same one step. So it actually checks the status of the ticket when you run the one step. So for set pending, to remove the pending, oops, there we go. Okay, so yeah, so I found one prompt. You actually, if I wanted to remove pending, the pending reason, I would probably set the blank. If I want to set it to something, then I would probably poke into the, like I'd make this into a list picker, and I'd poke into the, what is it, incident pending reason? What did I call it? Incident, maybe I called it pending reason. Now I've got a list picker out here somewhere for, there you go, incident pending reason. So I can set it to that. So incident pending, it's just poking into Cherwell, pulling the pending reasons out. So then if I go to incidents and I want to set one to pending, or let's see, let's do set pending. Then it asks me for the pending reason. I get the pending reason. So, but this is actually sending to the prompt, to the one step, a prompt. So, you know, in Cherwell, they all show up like one prompt and then another prompt and another prompt. The way the API works, you put all the prompts on one page. Like you could do multiple pages, but we put all the prompts on one page and do it all on one page. So then if prompts prompt other prompts, we have visible conditions and things you can do. So just keep in mind that the flow for one steps for prompts does not work like it does in Cherwell. You have to build that flow in your front end. All right, so let's go next. Saving versus creating, this gets a lot of newbies. One of the things that happens is there's only a save business object call, and it's the same for save and you save existing and create. So you got to be careful if you're updating record that you populate either the record's public ID or its rec ID. So you have to populate one of these two fields if you want to update it. If you don't, it will actually create a new. So for example, if you put like business object public ID in the list of fields and don't put it here, it will actually create a new ticket with a different ID. So you have to remember on your update, this is the only difference is you on an update, you populate one of these two fields, where on a create, you leave these empty. So on a, so that's why there's no create record, there's only a save record. And then it knows to create a record if these are empty, or knows to update it if there's something in there. So that's really common to mess up. I've even done it multiple times. Right? You'd think after once I would learn. No, multiple times. So another thing you have to watch out for is the required specific conundrum. So if you've got a UI for creating records that have specifics, and any of these specifics are required, you'll not be able to save the record. So for example, like in our framework, specifics are a different object, right? So, but if I go to create a record in our framework, if I put submit, so if I start typing submit, this email calendaring will pull back specifics. So I've got a little form for the specifics, and these are the specifics for that subcategory, right, that are sitting out there. Pretty easy to do. They're two separate objects. So we've got incident and we've got specifics, but we just merge them into one field. It's not a big deal. So, and then what happens behind the scenes is that when I click create on this and the incident is created, the incident's created, the specific is created in the background, and then I have to go out, retrieve the specific record that's related to that incident ID that's returned, and then I populate it with this information the user typed in. So it's actually, I've got the create incident call, I've got the retrieve related record call to get the related record back with the specifics in it, and then a save business object on the specifics record. So the problem is, and that works great. It goes really fast. The API is really fast. There's not a problem. The problem is if any of those fields in the specifics are required, what'll happen is when the incident's created, it'll auto create that specific, see that the field's not there, and throw an error. And there is no way around it. Please prove me wrong. If somebody can make it work, I will be very grateful. But all the testing we did, we even tried creating records with a generic specific with no required field, and then flipping it to a different specifics. We couldn't get it to work. So what you end up having to do is maybe API specific validation. So like what we do is we, like in call source, we'll create a mobile on call source, and then on the validation, we'll check for mobile. And if mobile's, if the call source is set to mobile, what it does is it ignores the validation for the specific fields. So then everybody entering that, say on the portal, has to fill in the specifics. But in our UI, we just make the specific required on our UI, so they have to fill it in, but it's actually not required in the background, otherwise it breaks. So this is a pretty big problem that with no real good workaround except to disable the validations for the API applications. So like, for example, if you're creating an incident from a monitoring program and you want to, and you created a specific incident type that has a specific with a required field, you will not be able to create that incident. You'll just get an error. So it's probably the biggest problem with creates in Cherwell's API. So there are some workarounds for it, but nothing that I would call great. There's some problems with Cherwell saved searches you should be aware of. So if you're running a Cherwell saved search, so for example, we have a couple different ways to do searches in our framework. So if I go to incidents and grid searches, and if I add a new search, I can just see all the searches that are in Cherwell. And there's a lot, right? So I can just pick any of these, like my open request. I can pick that, save it, and then when I go over to incidents, I will see that my open request, right? And then it just runs that query. The problem is, let me guess, I'm guessing this probably has an owned by. Let me see if owned by is filled out, take ownership of it. The problem is if something is not in the default grid, it's not returned in the record. So for example, if it's not in the default grid, I wouldn't be able to show it here unless I go back to the record, re-request it, and pull it back. So the problem with the global searches via the API, you only return the values that are in the default grid to the user. So if I create an ad hoc search, so for example, in here, if you do an ad hoc search instead, like this is an ad hoc query. So we're creating an ad hoc query in here where status is new or in progress or reopened or pending or assigned, and then owned by is the current. We just have a variable called logged in user that we have in our framework. So if you do that, then you can request what fields you want. So for example, in here, I would say, hey, I need the incident ID, customer display name, status, owned by team, owned by priority, breach notes, and description. And if I added a new field that wasn't in the default grid, it doesn't matter because I'll just request it in my API call. Where in the default, when you're requesting when you're running the stored query, you don't get to ask it what fields to return. It just returns you the base set. So kind of a problem, not a huge one because you can just go back and re-retrieve the record and get the field that you need. But like in our case, like in our mobile client, it's an extra round trip. So we just don't even do it. We just tell customers, hey, if you want to use a global query and you want to see that value, you just put it in your default grid. So so there's some 500 errors. Finally figured this out. So resetting the grid for the object, you go view records in an object and you can reset the grid back to like the default. That has fixed this problem for everybody. So if you get a 500 error when somebody tries to run a stored query, that has fixed it for everybody that I've tried it with. So finally, just a couple months ago, we figured that out. Before we were deleting the user ID and re-adding them back in, which also worked because it deleted their custom grids. But we didn't know that the custom grid was breaking it until quite recently. So there's some caching issues with it too, and parameters and caching, and lots of caching issues with these. So we generally try to stay away from these save queries. About the only time we need to do them is if we can't rewrite the query with our own query designer. And there's some issues there that are API specific. So the ad hoc query builder is good, and that's kind of what I showed before. There's a limited where clause. So for example, in this query builder, if I wanted any fields that are the same, always assumes an or. So if I do two owned bys, it's going to say owned by this user or owned by that user, which normally makes sense. Where you run into trouble is if you want to pull back all of the like not closed tickets or open new, whatever those are, and closed tickets that are like less than 30 days old, then there's no way to and those together. So you can't and together in the ad hoc query builder like status. Like if you want to get like all the new and all the resolved tickets and then the closed ones that have been closed in the last 30 days, you can't write that query. You have to write two queries and merge them together, which we don't. Our framework, we can't do that. For a more advanced query like that, we would just go to Cherwell and build it and then reference it in our framework. So, but we do like the ad hoc query builder. We can recreate say 95% of Cherwell's queries in it. Okay, so the relationships. So Cherwell has some pretty nifty API calls for relationships. Creating relationships work well. However, creating related records don't always. So we've standardized on a methodology where we create the records and then relate them together. So we create the record standalone and then relate it together later. So you must be careful how the relations are set up versus how they work in the API, and journal relationships are very common to work with. So a good example is journals. So for example, if I go into my relationship tab here, these are all the relationships that are specific to incident in Cherwell. So I added a journal note relationship. So one of the issues we ran into is if we create a related object and we want to create a journal note, out of box, there is no journal note relationship. So we have to create a journal record. And even if you set the journal type to note, it doesn't work. It's using that relationship to relate it, and it will revert it back to just straight up journal. So if you want to do something like create a related journal note, you have to create that relationship in Cherwell. Otherwise, it just won't work. So that is definitely a big gotcha.
Eric, we had a question pop in a couple of minutes ago with a link. Do you want to take a look at that?
Yeah, the get quick search specific results. Never use it. You might be able to set a grid. I know there's been that quick search is a little bit different. We don't use it in our framework, so I'm not exactly sure what it does and how it works. So I know also for the stored queries, they supposedly allow you to select a grid. That just seems like a lot of work to me. Like, we don't even recommend that to create custom grids for these queries. It just seems like a ton of work. So the only way I would even entertain it is if we had to have a Cherwell query and we couldn't use our ad hoc query builder, and they absolutely did not want to add a field to the default grid. And then even in that case, you can actually add the grid in the Blue client to your own personal grid, and it'll work for you in the as like a quote unquote default grid column. So if I drag a field over to my default grid for incident and I retrieve a stored query, it will actually come back. So that will actually work. So if you only have a few people using it, that's even a better solution. I just know I've seen a lot of talk on the message boards about that grid thing not working, and a lot of changes over the different versions. And one of the issues we have is we support every version basically from 8 to 10 decks. So things that change by version, we don't put into our framework because we can't have it work somewhere and not work somewhere else. So, but if somebody wants to try that and let us know if that actually works and what version that works in, maybe for other customers, that would be really helpful to be able to do that. All right, so public versus ID versus rec ID. So in the API calls, you can actually choose whether to use public ID or rec ID. So, and we put that in our framework by this object has unique public ID. So if we're saying, hey, if it has unique public ID, we'll use the public ID. So for incidents, tasks, changes, that's always going to be true. The public ID is the incident number. Where it gets tricky is a lot of times like friendly name for the CIs, or full name for the customer, where the public ID is actually duplicated, then we would uncheck this box. Like I would say, hey, it does not, and then it would use the rec ID. There really isn't a big difference between using the rec ID and the public ID, except the public ID is a lot smaller and easier to look at, and it's just we prefer to use the public ID. Rec ID will always be unique, and one other issue with it is the relationships and queries sometimes do not always reference the rec ID, so sometimes you need to use public ID. But like config items, definitely the worst. Config items and customer, definitely the worst offenders here. So, but yeah, when we switch to using rec ID, then we find other things that don't work. So kind of a hodgepodge, like Cherwell didn't necessarily design their workflow tool to work with their API, like they kind of built the two separately. So not everything works 100% when you start to like use rec ID relationship instead of public ID. So there definitely can be some issues there. All right, so team membership, this is a big problem. So if I want to do something as simple as this, like if I go into a ticket and I edit a ticket in my framework and I say, hey, I want to assign this to a different user. If I change it to second level support, generating this list of users in second level, there is no API call for it. It just doesn't exist. They don't have a get users. They have get users team membership, but no get team members. So the probably the best fix for most customers is to use the view team members view. So you create a view in SQL Server. It's really common. You can get it from us, or you can get it from Cherwell support, and then you basically create a loopback connector from your Cherwell to your SQL Server database, and you look at that view team members, and that will tell you everybody that's in that team. So that's probably the most straightforward way for people. In our framework, we actually have a caching mechanism that we use because our framework's hosted in Azure. So we actually have a caching mechanism that we use. That's right here. You can kind of see it. So we have a service account that we actually do and a team lookup. So we actually cache the teams and the users on Azure, like in Azure storage. And so we can retrieve that. So we actually have a special call to our own API. When I go in here and assign to somebody, we can actually go out to that view team members view, or in this case, we're actually going to our own API in our Azure cache. So that this is like the only thing we store in Azure. So, but we have some customers that don't want any data stored in Azure. So then they have to use the view team members because we do actually cache the team names and the members on Azure. So if your customer or think about becoming a customer, there's a work, we don't have to store it in Azure. It is easier. The downside of that for us is we're just refreshing that nightly. So it is not up to date. You can refresh it manually via our admin tool, but so that workaround works for us the best because then customers don't have to go through the process of creating that view if they're okay with their team names being stored on Azure, basically. So that's an issue. I'm not really going to touch on performance. We don't have a lot of time left, but it is really fast, right? So that you can scroll through records here in our public demo site probably a lot faster than you can load them up in Cherwell. And it's just because you can write your own front end. You don't have to do all the things Cherwell's doing. So you can see how fast I'm scrolling through this and just your navigation. So these are all API calls. So the API call to pull back this record is that fast. And every time I click through here, if it says loading record, it's going to an API call. Now if I go back, it's being cached, so it's super fast. It's being cached in the browser. But yeah, every time you go through those records, and you can have a lot, like if I go to all open, the performance is pretty good. So you'll probably see better performance in an API app than you see like in the Cherwell web or Windows client. So I would say, yeah, the Cherwell API is faster. And that's because you can kind of control what you show on the screen. But even like, you can see we're doing these queries when this comes up. They just all run really fast. So the performance is probably much better via the API than it would be otherwise. So I wanted to leave some time for questions. Looks like I have one more, but if anybody has any other questions, put them into the chat and I'll attempt to answer them. So yeah, have you tried or been successful in creating a custom connector for MS Power Platform using a data gateway? I haven't even tried. I kind of looked at it, but we've got so many other initiatives going on. I did work with a customer to create a custom Power BI adapter for an older version of Cherwell, so I assume it'd be very similar to that. It wasn't that hard, but because you don't have the straightforward REST calls for Cherwell, you kind of have to build those using Swagger, or I like to use what's it called? The little API tool, Postman. I like to use Postman. It's just not super straightforward, so I haven't tried it, but yeah, Postman, thanks. But yeah, so I haven't. So I don't know much about it. I know we have a smart bot coming out for Cherwell that will integrate with Cherwell, and that we started building on like Microsoft Autobot platform, and quickly found out it was going to be simpler to kind of build something ourselves. So, oh shoot, I have to open Teams to show that. But like if I go into here and type help, like this smart bot interrogate Cherwell for all this stuff. And so we ended up writing our own bot kind of framework. We're using Microsoft Bot Framework, but we're not using the automation tool in the backend. We just wrote it all in .NET. So, so this bot interacting with Cherwell, you could probably do that too, because they've got these bot tools. I didn't think it was that straightforward and as easy as it should be. It was almost easier to go write our own data layer. But we already had our data layer written for Cherwell, so we were able to piggyback on top of that. So if you want to do any bot development or anything like that, it's probably pretty simple. I just wasn't familiar with Microsoft's that stack, so I didn't get into that. We're more .NET shop, so it was just easier for us to write our bot framework in .NET and integrate with our existing framework rather than use Microsoft's bot developer. So, but I know Microsoft's got some pretty cool tools. I hope that Avanti actually releases some integrations to those tools. I know they're going to do Teams. a more solid Teams integration coming up. So hopefully they'll integrate some of those, like to maybe to that Power BI or some of the Power Automate platforms back there. It would be nice to have a little bit better automation or integration to Cherwell. Oh, okay. So outside of our framework, do you have an approach on security? Say business object is wide open. Yeah, security is tough with API because you can't restrict. You have to restrict by role essentially, or by something else at the object layer, and do the security that way. Unfortunately, Cherwell doesn't have any security built into their API. So, like if you have an HR, you're basically restricting the people to the HR tickets based on login. So when they log in via the REST API, Cherwell treats them just like a Windows client user. So when they log in with the REST API, you'll have access to everything. So you can say, hey, if this person's not in this role, they can't see these HR tickets, and they won't get stuff back. Now, I'm hearing, like, one of my consultants posted this morning and said, hey, that's where I'm trying to do it at a field level and it works great, but if I put it in a grid, they can see it. So there's some things, I don't know the ins and outs of that, but I will say if you do have secure data, the API, you really got to test that stuff before you roll an API out. Like from our framework, it's pretty easy because the admins can really restrict what people see, but and they don't, and people can't log in outside of our framework because they don't know the REST API key. So they're really limited to what their Cherwell admin determines they can see in our framework. But if you just give somebody a login and a REST API key, they can really go in and see everything. So it really, you have to lock it down on the Cherwell side by login ID. Good question. Have you explored Microsoft's Graph to replace Cherwell's email monitor? No, but that'd be really easy. I mean, that you might want to do that instead of using their monitor. So that Graph API is pretty darn powerful, and I've used it for the Teams integration quite a bit, and you can do a ton of stuff with it. In fact, if you're an Azure AD, I used to always integrate with PowerShell with the Active Directory integration pack. Probably going to switch that if you're on Azure AD to use the Graph API and do API calls instead. So I love the Graph API. You can do tons of stuff with it, and Microsoft keeps enhancing it more and more and more. And you can really, oh, Marcus came. Oh, Marcus, you just came at the end. But so it's getting better and better. So I think, boy, if somebody wanted to make a Graph API email monitor, that would be the bomb. That I could really see that being something that would work for people. So, of course, you'd have to rewrite all that functionality Cherwell has in theirs for keyword searching and all that stuff, but that'd really be cool. All right, Laura, I don't see any other questions, but I people keep popping in, so I don't know if the time was wrong for them, but so I saw Marcus jumped in, so I don't know, Marcus, if you were on before and just re-jumped in, but we're about done, so you're gonna have to watch the recording. So sorry about that if you got the wrong time. We have had some issues with time in this Teams presentation style, right, Laura? We've had problems in the past.
Yep, there's been some calendaring issues with
Yep.
the Teams webinars. It seems to get better every time we do it, but there's still some issues. So
Yeah.
for anyone who may have joined late, we did record. We'll be sending it out after it uploads in the next day or two here. And then for everyone who registered, we'll also email out the slide deck, so you'll have that as well.
Yeah, and a link to this recording so they'll be able to see this too. So yeah, I really apologize if the time was wrong and you just jumped in hoping to see me talk about REST API. But yeah, yes, and once again, if you want us to do advanced practitioner going the other way, I can do that too. I don't have a presentation for it, so I'd have to write one up, but I don't mind it. I got some good examples. We could maybe even use like Teams as an example of going out or something like that. So so that might be cool. So just let Laura know if you want to see anything else like on Cherwell. If if you wanted to talk. I know I've got a really good performance tuning one that people always get good information out of. So we've got some other advanced practitioners we could redo if people wanted to join and get their questions answered, or we could go over like performance tuning. We could go over somebody's health check live. So we could do some cool stuff like that. But thanks everybody for joining. I do have to jump for another call.
All right. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody. Appreciate it, and hope you'll join us on the next one. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.